So this is the condensed version of Unit 2, which was on cognition, and hopefully you remember cognition is all about thinking. Different types of cognitive processes: attention, language, learning, memory, perception, and thought. So really this is more than just this unit. We have a separate unit on learning, and we have a separate unit on perception where we did sensation and perception. Metacognition is a fancy word that just means thinking about thinking. Like, why am I thinking about this? Why am I learning about this? How do I solve these problems? All of those questions about your thinking is metacognition. All right, involves other things: concepts, problem solving, decision making, judgment formation. So a concept is just a mental grouping of similar objects. Jean Piaget called them schemas. So for example, a chair is something that usually has some type of legs and you can sit on it. So that's a schema. Then a prototype is what is a typical example of that. So a chair that has 4 legs, a back and a bottom, that's a classic chair. But could a broken tree that fell down in the woods be a chair? Sure. It doesn't fit the prototype, but you could sit on it. Be careful of snakes. So concept and schema is just the general grouping, but prototype is the classic example. How do we organize our concepts? Different ways, but a lot of times into category hierarchies. So hierarchies are just these things that have, it's kind of like a family tree, the different layers to them. When we're developing those concepts, again, we usually start with a prototype, but then we're able to think of other examples. So prototype may be the robin type bird, but things like a penguin or an ostrich, they don't fix the prototype. So what happens when we encounter new information? We talk about this also in the development unit, but assimilation is where we blend information into what we know already. So where she's looking down at the dog and she's like, doggy, but then she looks at the cat, she's also like, doggy. That's assimilation. Then later on, dad is telling her, here's the difference between a dog and a cat. So now she knows, and that's accommodation. A reminder, we also learned accommodation in the last section on vision. Accommodation is when your lenses in your eye constantly are flexing to see close and far away stuff. So accommodation has 2 different meanings in psych. So we also use the example with zebras and horses, but there. So assimilation, again, they blend it into an existing schema. Accommodation, they adapt their existing schema to incorporate new information. All right, other problem solving, we've got trial and error, algorithms, and heuristics. Trial and error, just random. You try one thing, doesn't work. Try something else. You can find an answer, but it may take a while. It's random, haphazard. Algorithms are where you try every single possibility. It can be time consuming, but you will get the answer. So computers use algorithms. A human using an algorithm would be like if you were going to search for something at the grocery store, you start on aisle 1 and you check every single shelf, every single row until you find what you're looking for. It'll take a long time, but you will get there. Here was the friendship algorithm from the Big Bang Theory. A heuristic, though, is a shortcut, a rule of thumb. Who is at the door? A heuristic is a shortcut. So instead of going through all the aisles, we talked about like duck sauce. Like, okay, I think duck sauce is going to be on the Asian food aisle. So instead, I'm going to go straight there. But it could be wrong. Maybe they're weird and they put duck sauce next to ketchup, which is a totally different area. So heuristics, it's a shortcut. They're less time, but they're more error prone. And we got 2 types of heuristics. I don't know if that's on here. Yes. So 2 types of heuristics. The representative heuristic is where you base your decision off of how well something matches your prototype. So the example we had, you meet a slim short man who wears glasses and likes poetry. What do you think his profession is? And you compare, is he a professor? Is he a truck driver? Well, in my mind, he fits the prototype for a professor. But statistically, he's way more likely to be a truck driver just because there's lots and lots more truck drivers than professors. We gave another example with criminal or librarian. Can't necessarily tell. Availability heuristic is, again, you're trying to make your decision, but you're basing it off of how easily examples come to mind, the most recently available information. So when you're thinking about crime, what did you hear about on the news? When you're talking about what college you want to go to, does your uncle talk all the time about Texas A&M? That's information that's recently available to you. So you base your information off that. Is it the best? We don't don't know. Maybe you watch the news and they only talk about crime because that gets a lot of views, and that overestimates the number of violent crimes. Your uncle talks about how much they love Texas A&M, but there's lots of other schools. You're just not exposed to that information, so you don't necessarily know what else is a good option. Let's see, we did those examples. All right, fixation is an obstacle to problem solving. That's when you can't see things from a fresh perspective. The matchstick problem was like, how do you make a triangle? All these triangles, and people don't usually picture that they could make a pyramid. The better examples were overcoming functional fixedness, all the random ways in the world that you find different ways to fix things, like making hot dogs in a coffee maker. When you're in college, you're going to find ways to do stuff that you didn't think you knew of. But hopefully you find examples of overcoming functional fixedness in your everyday life all the time. Mental set is we tend to do things a certain way because it worked in the past. It may not be the best way, but you still do it. So all of you IVN people who do your IVN the night before, it usually works and you usually get a pretty good grade, but not always. On this last one, I was a little more strict on if your explanation or your picture made sense. And if you just drew a picture but didn't write a caption to it, you might have lost a point. So your mental set of, I'll just do it this way all the time. Most of the time it works unless Ms. Thomas is more strict. Let's see, making judgments. How information is framed affects how we judge it. So if something is 25% fat, 75% lean, graduation rates are 97%. That sounds really good, but what if we say dropout rates for that district are 3%? Which makes it sound better or worse? I talked about framing in politics. Priming is the idea that when you talk about something, then it kind of leads you on to the next idea. So for example, what's the one on here? Seeing a picture of money before making a decision might make someone more likely to choose a financially beneficial option. There's better examples for this, but I don't want to try to come up with them off the top of my head. But it's the idea that if whatever is in your mind already is more likely to influence your views. It's kind of like availability heuristic. Gambler's fallacy is that false belief that if something hasn't happened for a long time, that your chances of it happening will go up. So like you flip a coin 10 times and 9 times you got heads and you're like, oh, I'm for sure going to get tails this time. Like my chances have gone up. No, it's still a 50-50 chance, but you just think it's gone up because it hasn't happened in a while. Sunk cost fallacy, you stick with a decision, even if you know it's really not a good idea, but you already put in all the time and energy. You're like, well, this kind of goes with like people who are gonna drop a class in college. Like they've been in there all that time, they're failing, they're not gonna get credit, but I might as well just finish it out, even if it's not necessarily the best use of their time. Sunk cost fallacy. So sometimes you should stay, sometimes you shouldn't, but it's the idea you just stick around because you already invested. Executive functions. The idea that we are just constantly trying to change our cognitive processes, that we're pulling up memories, we're trying to tune out other things, we're planning, we're reasoning. Executive function is just the idea that you can multitask and organize and plan out. You got lots of things going on in your brain all at one time. Creativity, 2 types really, convergent and divergent thinking. Your creativity increases the more expertise you have. So for example, as a teacher, as a first-year teacher, I was way less creative than I am now because I have so much more expertise in knowing my content. Having a lot of intrinsic motivation, like you're just passionate about art, maybe makes you a better painter. So all those things lead to creativity. Divergent thinking, your ideas separate, so you're generating lots of possible ideas. Convergent thinking, they blend together. You got to narrow them down to one best choice. That was all part 1. Man, part 1 was long. Part 2 is encoding. So these are all part of the memory process. We had encoding, storage, and retrieval. Each one got their own whole section. The Atkinson-Shiffrin model says there's 3 stages of memory, which are sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. And we select some information to move on at each stage. Some gets lost, some gets stored. It just depends how much we rehearse it. Working memory is another name for short-term memory. Let's see, disorders that affect working memory, schizophrenia, because we have scattered thoughts, and then Alzheimer's, which causes memories to go away. When we encode information, a lot of information is automatically processed. You're walking down the hall, you saw your friend, it's encoded. You just random things. But other new information, usually if it's unusual, requires attention. If you're trying to remember a phone number, that's like the hardest thing ever nowadays. Then you consciously have to rehearse it. That would be intentional. Other things that are automatically encoded, spacings, like you can remember where things were, like in a book page or in a room. Time, like I remember it was kind of like in the morning before lunch, or I remember it was after school. You can kind of remember timing, and then how often, like, oh man, I saw that kid twice today, but he's not in my third period. I don't know where he went. So sometimes frequency, those are automatically encoded. For effortful processing, again, that's just information that requires effort. It can lead to durable memories, but not always. Sometimes you just study and study and study and you don't remember. Our guy who studied memory, who is not among the names you have to remember, was Herman Ebbinghaus. That's why I have a hippo named Herman, because we have memories of hippo and hippocampus, and he's named for Herman Ebbinghaus. But he studied nonsense syllables to prove that fewer repetitions were required to remember things later, which is why it took us however many months to learn the whole course, and we're relearning the whole course in just a few days, because it takes us fewer times to recall the information now. Spacing effects as we retain information better over time. So we're rehearsing, we're doing this over 2 or 3 weeks as opposed to just 2 or 3 days. Spacing effect is better. Serial position effect says when we're looking at list items, we remember better the stuff at the beginning and the end of the list. Beginning of the list, we remember because we've rehearsed it. It's gone through our brain multiple times. Now it's in long-term memory. Recency effect, the stuff at the end of the list, is still in our short-term memory. We can also apply this to our entire course. We tend to remember the stuff from the beginning of the year because we talked about it a lot, and we remember our recent stuff. A lot of the stuff in the middle is the harder stuff for us to recall. We encode by meaning, and that's semantics. We encode by images, that's iconic. Organization, like if it's in a hierarchy, and by sound, which is acoustic. So again, semantic is by meaning, acoustic is hearing, visual is encoding, or not visual, visual is you can see it. The best way to remember is semantic, like you know why or what it means. If you don't know what a brain part means, it's hard to like apply it to a situation. But hearing it and then seeing it, we've done all the steps in psych. You've drawn stuff, you've heard me, that's why I say watch and listen to the flip videos. Don't just like look at it and write stuff down because you're not getting all the types of encoding. Some other words, sometimes you hear the terms shallow processing versus deep processing of memories. Shallow processing means we're just looking at like the physical structure, like what font it was in, were there capital letters, what did it actually like structurally look like, versus deep processing, that's the same thing as semantic encoding. So if you're deep processing all the information, you really know what it means, versus if you only shallow processed it, you're like, oh, she used Comic Sans. Why would she use Comic Sans? That's such an old font. I don't. So depth of processing, again, semantic encoding is the best. Self-reference effect says that we remember better things that relate to ourselves. Elaborate, when we elaborate is when we add more details. Your history teacher tells you a whole story about a battle, and then you're like more likely to remember the causes and the effects of that. So lots more details. That's also part of semantic. Visual encoding is very strong, saying you shouldn't vape, and then you see healthy lungs versus vaping lungs, or somebody who's in the hospital from vaping. Next in line effect, we tend not to remember what somebody said just before us because we're next in line. We're like, oh, what am I going to talk about? Information minutes before sleep is seldom remembered. So you have to give yourself time for it to get transferred from short-term to long-term memory. If you're reading and then you fall asleep, those last maybe 30 minutes there, it's gone. You wasted it. Go like walk around, go take your shower, go do stuff. Motivation to remember, the more motivated you are when you encode the information, the more likely you are to recall it later. Not motivation when you're recalling it, but when you learn, I'm like, hey, don't forget this. It's going to be on the AP test later. That's motivation to remember. Spacing effect. It's better to space over time. Don't cram. I'm trying to finish this section. Space practice lasts longer than mass practice. Tricks for encoding, mnemonic devices. Those are all the little memory techniques. Peg word system, you memorize pegs like one bun, two shoe, and then you relate words to that. Method of loci, you relate things to locations. Chunking, you break it into memorable units. Acronyms like Roy G. Biv, My Very Educated Mother, PEMDAS, and then hierarchies. I think that's the last one. All right, so we did the first 2 parts. We will pause there.